Well, thank you to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak. And so this is based on joint work with Dorit Aharonov and Xiao-Liang, which came out this month. And here's the archive number. So to begin, we'd like to begin by asking the question, what is an experiment? Now, there are many different protocols which fall under the umbrella of experimental physics, and they're actually extremely diverse. And it's not obvious what we mean in a precise way by an experiment. But by means of example, experiments include measuring constants of nature, such as the speed of light or the charge of an electron, quantifying dynamical properties, such as the rate of a chemical reaction, inferring structural properties, such as the symmetry group of a crystal, or learning more abstract information, such as the chain of chemical reactions that comprise photosynthesis, whether Yang-Mills describes the strong force. So we would like to ask in a mathematically precise way, what exactly is an experiment in its full scope of generality? Now we can bring the perspective of the quantum extended Church-Turing thesis to bear on this question. And roughly speaking, the thesis is a universal quantum computer can efficiently simulate any physical system. And as such, we might believe that we can describe physical experiments using the language of quantum information theory and quantum complexity theory. So this suggests that we might ask the following questions. Is an experiment a type of algorithm? What is the complexity of an experiment? Can tools from quantum algorithms speed up experiments? And is there a provable advantage of coherent versus incoherent apparatus? A question which I'll make precise a little bit later. So in this talk, I'm going to address these questions as well as establish a new kind of exponential advantage for quantum experiments. So to begin with, we would like to abstract the notion of an experiment. And to do so, we require three different subsystems. We're going to designate a nature subsystem, a lab subsystem, and a working space system. So in the nature system, this is going to be the system that we would like to learn something about. Namely, it's where it contains the data of nature, and it's the system which we wish to interrogate in the experiment. The lab consists of the degrees of freedom which directly couple with nature. And the working space consists of our ancillary apparatus that does not directly interact with nature, but can include, for example, our computer or our quantum computer, or things that we use to post-process data. So we'll elaborate more on what each of these contains shortly, but here we allow for interactions, of course, between nature and the lab, as well as interactions between the lab and the working space, but we do not allow for interactions between the working space and nature. So an experiment can be thought of as a hybrid of a black box algorithm and an interactive protocol. Nature can be thought of as the black box. It is the data which we don't immediately have access to, but we would like to understand. But we can query it and we can interact with it to perform an experiment. So that's the sense in which it can be thought of as a hybrid between a black box algorithm and an interactive protocol. So just to put some pictures to these boxes, the nature system can be thought of as our experimental sample, or as containing our experimental samples, such as, for example, this picture of graphene. The lab contains the equipment which directly couples to nature, and the working space, among other things, can contain our classical or quantum computer, which interfaces with the apparatus. And we can also have additional apparatus here, which does not directly couple to nature. So the way that the modus operandi of an experiment is that we have inputs to our classical or quantum computer, which initializes it and potentially instructs the lab apparatus what to do, namely instructs it how it is to interact, for example, with the nature system. And the nature system has some initial state, which we don't have access to, rho naught. And then the protocol is a series of interactions between the working space, the lab, and nature, which can have an interesting feedback process and ultimately yields the output of the experiment, which is given on the computer. And this is the information which we desire to learn by performing the experiment. So we're going to require three definitions, which are going to allow us to make more precise problem statements, which are that of the lab oracle, a QUALM, and a task. The lab oracle is the data of nature. It is an oracle that we can query, namely it's the hidden information of nature, as well as the encodes the way that we are allowed to interact with nature, the way that the lab system is allowed to interact with the nature system. And then the residual parts of the protocol is the quantum algorithmic measurement, or QUALM, QUALM. The QUALM is the quantum algorithm that we run on the working space and the lab system. And the QUALM can be thought of as our description of the precise experimental protocol which we are going to use. So the QUALM has as inputs the inputs to the working space, as well as the lab oracle. So the QUALM is a procedure that takes as inputs onto the working space, as well as a description of nature and the way that it responds to being probed by the lab system, and then ultimately produces outputs, which are the outputs of the experiment. So a QUALM can be thought of as a map from the space of lab oracles and the space of inputs to the space of outputs. And finally, a task is a problem specification. It specifies what we want the QUALM to do, namely what we want the experiment to achieve. So let's work with a more concrete set of examples to orient ourselves. So let's begin with X-ray diffraction. So in X-ray diffraction, we will not worry about the inputs to the working space. We'll essentially fix those. And we will consider a family of lab oracles which correspond to different kinds of crystals that we would like to characterize. And the output that we would like of our QUALM is to be the shape of the crystal, some characterization of the crystal structure. So our working space can contain detectors, a laser, our laptop, and other tools like this. And the degrees of freedom which directly interact with the lab oracle, namely the nature system, are photons. So we emit photons from some laser, they go in, the ingoing photons then scatter off of the crystal, and then which gives outgoing photons which encode interesting phase information, which is then processed in the working space, and ultimately the shape of the crystal is outputted after post-processing. So the task is to find the shape of a crystal, and here an X-ray diffraction experiment is a QUALM which achieves the task. It's an experimental protocol which allows us, for given any crystal, to output the shape of a crystal. Now, another example, which is slightly more abstract and is along the lines that we're going to pursue shortly for proving theorems, is distinguishing between two quantum states. So here, we're not going to worry about the inputs to nature and the inputs to the working space. We'll have those be fixed. And we will consider two families of lab oracles, or two possible lab oracles, namely a lab oracle which outputs the state psi naught every time it is queried, and a lab oracle which outputs the state psi 1 each time it is queried. In particular, we can imagine the lab system is being built of n qubits, and when the lab oracle is queried, each of the psi naught and psi 1 are n qubit states, and the lab oracle simply prepares a copy of the state on the lab system. So when it's queried, it acts like a quantum source, which produces a state psi naught on the lab system each time it's queried. And if we want to have access to more than one copy of psi naught simultaneously, we need to leverage the working space as a quantum memory. So then the task is to find a quantum algorithmic measurement which can distinguish between the two lab oracles. Namely, in the event that we are given lab oracle L0 or LO0, then the QUALM outputs 0. And if we're given LO1, then we output 1. So the QUALM is to achieve the task of distinguishing between the two quantum sources, one which gives us psi naught each time it's queried, and the other which gives psi 1 each time it's queried. So as one final example, if we trivialize nature in the lab, we make them trivial subsystems, then we're simply left with the working space, which we could regard as a quantum algorithm. Namely, the working space can be our quantum computer. We have inputs and outputs. We can more generally have them be quantum inputs and quantum outputs. And so in this sense, quantum algorithms can be regarded as a special case of quantum algorithmic measurements. So there's many other examples, and we believe that all known and possible experiments fit into this paradigm. The all known experiments is a claim, and the all possible experiments is a conjecture. So here's a list of different types of experiments which fit into this paradigm where we talked about quantum algorithms, quantum state tomography, quantum Hamiltonian tomography, quantum verification, etc. And in the paper, we discuss ways in which various of these fit into the QUALM framework. But more broadly, we're going to see that the QUALM framework helps us to analyze experiments using tools from quantum complexity theory and to ask new questions. And the generality of the framework will inspire some new and novel experiments, which we will describe later on. Proposed experiments, not experiments which have been done. So before proceeding, we've talked about this abstract black box point of view. So let's, to unpack these black box diagrams of nature, lab, and the working space, it's nice to look at a quantum circuit point of view for a moment. And so here we can see the protocol as it unfolds in time. And the data of the lab oracle includes a super operator, which couples nature and the lab system, and also the state of the initialized state of nature, which in this slide is called rho n. And the data of the quantum algorithmic measurement includes the quantum circuits acting jointly on the lab and the working space, as well as instructions to query the lab oracle. So taken all together, this gives us an experiment in which we have some inputs and some outputs, which determines information about nature as asked by the task. So now the complexity of a quantum algorithmic measurement is simply the gate complexity of all of the all of those gates which we use on the lab and working space, plus the number of times we query the lab oracle. So it's just the gate complexity with respect to some universal gate set of these unitary operations here, plus the number of times that we query the lab oracle, i.e. the number of blue boxes that appear in the protocol. So this is a combination of computational complexity and query complexity, which quantifies the resources required to do an experiment. So often you might think that you should just do query complexity because that's the number of times that you access the experimental, the nature subsystem. But in fact, a better quantification of the resources is if you also count the gate complexity of what you're actually doing in the lab and working space, since this is more diagnostic of the resources required to perform the experiment. So as such, we are going to look jointly at this gate complexity and this query complexity. And if we wish, we could put a cost parameter lambda here to weight the number of lab oracle queries. So our analyses will combine techniques from each type of complexity theory. So finally, we'll talk about the complexity of a task. And the complexity of a task is the minimum complexity over QUALMs achieving that task. And this quantifies the minimal resources required to achieve the task. So the complexity of a task is simply the minimum over all QUALMs of the complexity of a QUALM. So it is the resources required to perform the task, in the sense that it's the complexity of the simplest QUALM which will do so, or the lowest complexity QUALM which will do so. So finally, we need one other piece of information before we can start to talk about particular problem statements or complexity theoretic advantages, which is answered by the question how is information communicated between the lab and working space? So far, we've talked about how information is communicated between the nature system and the lab system. Namely, it's mediated by the lab oracle, by some channel which couples the nature system and the lab system. But we can also ask, how does the lab system, which contains the degrees of freedom which directly interact with nature, how does the lab system directly interact with the working space? The answer to that question is that there is some communication protocol. There's some way in which information is communicated back and forth between the lab and working space systems. And we're going to consider two different ways in which information can be transmitted between the lab and the working space. One is a model that we call coherent access, in which information is communicated by a quantum channel. And another is incoherent access, in which information is communicated by a classical channel, namely via LOCCs. And furthermore, in the incoherent access model, we'll suppose that the lab system, between each query of a lab oracle, intermediately the lab system has to be completely measured by the operations on the lab. So in other words, there's no coherence between the lab system and the working space, and there's also no coherence, or rather, you have to have a complete measurement in between lab oracle accesses. So in that sense, there's a loss of coherence in between lab oracle accesses. So this can be said maybe summarily in a slightly simpler way. In the coherent access model, we have access to a quantum memory, and we can perform quantum computation on stored quantum data in that memory. Whereas in the incoherent access protocol, we do not have a quantum memory, but we can do quantum computation on stored classical data. And with that classical data, we can still employ adaptive strategies. So this is a way of thinking about the distinction between the coherent axis and incoherent axis models. So now we can refine our notion of the complexity of a task using the notion of access. In particular, the coherent axis complexity is the complexity of the simplest complexity QUALM, where we constrain the QUALM to have coherent access. And similarly, in the incoherent axis complexity of a task, it's the minimal complexity over all QUALMs, where those QUALMs are all restricted to have incoherent access. So our goal is going to find a task in which we can have an exponential advantage between the coherent axis complexity and the incoherent axis complexity. Now, let me briefly remark that there are other axis types that we're not going to talk about here. This is a table from the paper. We're going to be considering the distinction between the incoherent axis and coherent axis strictly. And let me make a few quick remarks. One is that we're interested in QUALM complexity, which is physically important. QUALM complexity means that we want an advantage both in query complexity and in gate complexity simultaneously. Now, there are many other works in which there is an exponential query complexity advantage, or there's several other works in which there's an exponential query complexity advantage between coherent axis and incoherent axis. But our work is the first to provide an exponential advantage in both gate complexity and query complexity simultaneously. And that's physically important because that better characterizes the resources which are required to perform an experiment. Now, let me clarify one common potential confusion, which is how does Simon's algorithm fit into this? It seems to be a black box algorithm which naively provides some exponential advantage of coherent over incoherent axis. But that's actually not the case. Simon's algorithm actually sits within the non-adaptive incoherent axis setting. And the quantum algorithm, which solves Simon's problem, namely Simon's algorithm, only requires the experimentalist to prepare product states and make product measurements. So accordingly, Simon's algorithm provides an exponential advantage of non-adaptive incoherent axis QUALMs over classical QUALMs, whereas our work is concerned with the advantage of coherent axis QUALMs over adaptive incoherent axis QUALMs. So this is better illustrated in the following diagram. Here's a hierarchy of different axis types. There's an exponential advantage here due to Simon's algorithm, and the exponential advantage that we claim is between adaptive incoherent axis and coherent axis, which is in our present work. So let me now present a problem for which we can find such an exponential advantage between incoherent and coherent axis. So the intuition for this thing called the fixed unitary problem is that it's difficult to distinguish time-independent evolution from time-dependent evolution if each is sufficiently chaotic. And we're going to make this intuition precise by first formulating a task. So let's consider that we have a lab system of n qubits, and we have a family of lab oracles. In particular, we have two possible lab oracles. One which outputs, when it's queried, applies an n qubit unitary U0 to the lab system. And it applies the same unitary each time. And another lab oracle which applies a different unitary each time when it is queried to the lab system. And we will assume that U0 is a Haar random unitary. It's the same each time, but it's Haar random at the outset. So it's chosen once and for all Haar randomly, and then the lab oracle provides the same unitary each time. Whereas for this lab oracle, we get IID Haar random unitaries each time. And the goal of the task is to find a QUALM which can distinguish between these two lab oracles, namely can distinguish between a lab oracle which is giving the same unitary each time or a different unitary each time. So the theorem from the paper is that the coherent axis complexity of the fixed unitary problem on n qubits is upper bounded by n in terms of both the sum of query complexity and gate complexity, whereas in the incoherent axis model, it's lower bounded by an exponential in n for both query and gate complexity. So this establishes an exponential separation between coherent axis and incoherent axis, which is a new kind of exponential separation in quantum complexity theory. So the linear upper bound on coherent axis task complexity, namely this is easy. We just have to find a single coherent axis QUALM that does the job. But the exponential lower bound is highly non-trivial for incoherent axis task complexity because we need to rule out all efficient incoherent axis QUALMs. So to give a brief sketch of how this lower bound works, I'll just say a few words about it, which is that the sketch of the proof is to reduce lower bounding incoherent axis QUALMs to a simpler type of QUALM called a simple measurement QUALM. And we can essentially show that simple measurement QUALMs, which entail a single measurement and a single preparation between each lab oracle call, that incoherent axis QUALMs can be thought of as linear combinations of simple measurement QUALMs. So it reduces to studying simple measurement QUALMs. And then we showed that even for adaptive simple measurement QUALMs, the final output can't distinguish between the two lab oracles with exponentially many lab oracle calls. And as such, this provides the lower bound. So this uses techniques from representation theory, combinatorics, and random matrix theory, in particular, the theory of Weingarten functions. So let me offer one other problem for which we find an exponential advantage, which is related, which we call the symmetry distinction problem. The intuition for this is that it's difficult to determine the symmetry classes of strongly interacting quantum many-body systems. And to make this precise, we first recall time reversal symmetry classes of unitaries. Namely, we have normal regular unitaries, we have orthogonal matrices, we have symplectic matrices, which may be among the least familiar. So the symmetry distinction problem is similar. We have three lab oracles in which the first lab oracle always applies an n-qubit unitary onto the lab space. The second lab oracle always applies the same n-qubit orthogonal matrix onto the lab space, and the third applies a symplectic matrix. So these correspond to unitaries belonging to three different classes of time reversal symmetry. And the goal is to find a QUALM which distinguishes between these three types of lab oracles, namely determines the type of time reversal symmetry which is being employed. And similarly, we find an exponential advantage for the symmetry distinction problem. We find a similar exponential advantage between coherent axis and incoherent axis. And again, this bound is easy, but it's actually interesting. We essentially use a swap test, which is also what we use for the unitary for the previous problem which I described. And then the exponential lower bound is as usual is very difficult in the incoherent axis case. So let me make a few concluding remarks. So a contemporary paradigm of quantum supremacy is that quantum computers are better than classical computers at classical problems. But there's a notion here of quantum supremacy, which is that quantum coherence has advantage over incoherence for quantum experiments. And this might be relevant, a notion of quantum advantage, which can be very relevant for experimental systems. Finally, we've established a new framework for analyzing quantum experiments using quantum complexity theory. And this opens up a whole new set of questions. So we've established that coherent coupling between experimental apparatus and a quantum computer or a quantum memory can lead to exponential savings in resources. And as far as we know, this is the first exponential advantage simultaneously in query and gate complexity of its kind. So one question is, can an experimental demonstration of QUALM advantage be realized in the NISQ era? This would entail understanding the effects of noise, for instance. And it would also be desirable to have other more physical examples with coherent QUALM advantage. In particular, the effects of noise are particularly might be particularly challenging to deal with in order to, namely, to find an exponential advantage between coherent axis and incoherent axis complexity, where you assume that your apparatus is noisy. So with that in mind, thank you for your attention and happy to answer any further questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that really nice talk. So I can see there have indeed been some questions on Slack already, and I'll just sort of go through these in order. So the first question is by Jakub Czatovsky, who asks, is it important that the lab and the workspace are set to pure states?
No, it's not.
Okay.
We consider the case of, in general, we consider interactions which are actually quantum channels, and we consider mixed states.
Great, thank you. That's a nice quick answer. So next question is by Richard Kung, who asks, Haar random unitaries are by definition exponentially complex. So can you comment why this doesn't interfere somehow with your setup and the intuitive takeaways that you get from this? For example, is it possible to replace the Haar random unitaries with T designs, which are less complex to generate? Yeah,
that's a great question. So, so the answer is that we are thinking about the complexity of the random unitaries as being part of of the nature system. So it's something that nature is providing us with that could potentially be very complex. And as such, we're not actually including the complexity of that. This is what is inside this lab oracle, this black box. But indeed, as Richard was saying, or suggesting in his question, it would be nice to be able to do a version of this with either pseudo-random unitaries, which are easier to generate in the lab. Because if you wanted to do a version of this experiment, you would actually have to, and establish a quantum advantage, you would actually have to create these random unitaries in order to do this experimentally or in practice. So indeed, it would be great to do a version of this with t-designs, although if you do t-designs for any polynomial t, I think you're only going to get a polynomial advantage. So indeed, this, I think, goes into this question of what are more physical examples with coherent QUALM advantage. Physical examples meaning, as Richard was suggesting, that we would like the lab oracle to also be something which is only polynomially complex. So that's in a certain sense a future direction.
Great, thank you. The next question is by Abhinav Deshpande, who asks, is the exponential separation that you have an average case statement?
Yeah, I mean, how do I say? Because of the way we've set up the problem, the problem is set up so that is the case. I mean, so yeah, the short answer is yes.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I've got, I can see 3 more questions on the moment. I'll see if I get through those, and let's see how we get on after that. We may need to grab the questions for Slack or the roundtable. So Andrea Rocchetto next asks, how do the exponential improvements in measurement accuracy that can be obtained with quantum metrology fit within your framework? Because it looks like these results from quantum metrology also show an exponential advantage for coherent access over incoherent access.
So I'm not exactly sure what particular works are being referred to, but we definitely thought about certain circumstances in which we thought about certain quantum metrology protocols, but I would be happy to discuss in more detail on Slack or other places what particular work the person who asked the question has in mind.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, please, let's take that discussion off to the side. Next question by Raul Garcia Petron which is a very fundamental question, which is, I guess he guesses that you're assuming that quantum mechanics completely captures nature's behavior. What if this is not the whole story? How does this affect your results?
Then indeed, we need something beyond the quantum extended Church-Turing thesis, and we would need a more general framework that captures whatever it is that goes beyond quantum mechanics. And of course, people have various ideas about this, and I have nothing to say about this, but presumably a similar framework could be done in whatever your choice extension of quantum mechanics is, if you so have one.
And a somewhat connected question, which I guess will make the last question in this session, is by Chinmay Nirka, who's asking, are you assuming that the interaction between nature and lab is a finite dimensional quantum system, or is infinite dimensional quantum okay? And if the latter, how do you quantify the complexity of the infinite dimensional space?
Yeah, so we've considered in all of our particular examples finite dimensional Hilbert spaces. Although in the problems we've analyzed finite dimensional versions. Of course, if you want to, I talked about photons and other examples in which if you have a bosonic Fock space, that's clearly infinite dimensional. So we have not thought about the infinite dimensional case in detail. That's a very interesting question, and I don't presently have anything quantitative to say about it.
Great, well, I think that's a nice place to stop. So thank you very much to all of the speakers for some really fantastic talks in this session. I'd just like to finish by reminding everyone in the audience about the roundtables, which you can take advantage of for further discussion of these results. So you can join these using the roundtable button below the stage that you can see. And there are 3 different roundtables, one for each speaker.